friend of mine and I had a very deep discussion and disagreement at church yesterday, and the question was brought up whether or not God created evil. And my answer is no. His answer was yes, and he said that if your answer is no, this is a conundrum because it necessitates a creator who's capable of creating things just like God is. And I said that's not correct. Satan is only capable of corruption, not creation. There's only one creator, God. Another thing that he brought up was the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil that was planted in the garden. And I'll get to that in a second. I want to deal with the initial question first. And after I deal with both of these questions, I want to highlight some things in science that help us to understand good versus evil, whether or not evil is something that's created or whether it's just an action or an adjective that we use to modify that action. You have a father, right, who goes to his son and says, son, I want you to go to the store. I want you to buy bacon. I want you to buy milk, and I want you to buy eggs. I do not want you to buy candy. Here's $20. Go and do as I ask. And the son goes to the store, and he finds the milk, and he finds the eggs, and he finds the bacon, and he goes and he purchases these 3 items. And after purchasing these 3 items, he sees that he's got enough left over for a candy bar. And in spite of the fact that he was expressly forbidden from purchasing the candy bar because he had leftover money, he decided to purchase that candy bar. And so now the question arises, is this kid being obedient? And the answer to that question is no. His father told him not to get that candy bar, not to get any candy of any sort. And he's disobedient. So when he goes back to the father and he says, here's the milk, here's the bacon, and here's the eggs, and here's the receipt, and then he pulls out that candy bar to eat it, the father is not unjustified in disciplining him because this son broke his father's commandment. And what we find is that disobedience is the absence of obedience. It is not something that the father created. It is not something that the father unintentionally created. It is an action that the son engages in. Obedience and disobedience are something you can do. They are not things. Likewise, evil is not a created thing. It is the absence of good. Sin is the absence of God's presence in your life. And likewise, evil actions are the absence of good actions in your life. They're not a created thing. They are something that we use to describe an action. God calls evil disobedience to his word and his commandments. When Adam and Eve chose disobedience over obedience to God's word, God called that sin. And it's pretty easy to recognize it. He called that sin. He calls sin evil. Evil is sin. Disobedience is evil. Therefore, sin is disobedience to God's word. And so, again, coming back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, if we go back to Genesis 1, just a chapter or 2 away from where we're at, in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, we find that God created everything good. A matter of fact, when all of creation was finished, he called it all very good. So the knowledge of good and evil is not a bad thing, right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil is not the bad thing. But at this point in time, there's only one person in the entire cosmos that perfectly understands good and evil. And to this date, that's still true. Only God knows perfectly what good and evil is. Christ lived it out in his life and showed us that obedience to God's word is acting in obedience, is acting in good, is acting in faith towards God, is keeping God in your life, is keeping his presence in your life. And that failing to do so is very clearly choosing to step away from God's presence in your life. A matter of fact, as we go through the entire Bible, starting with Cain, because we've already covered Adam and Eve, God warned Cain, said, hey, sin is crouching at the door. Master it before it masters you. In other words, disobedience can become your master. Evil can become your master. You will become a slave to sin, something that Paul fleshes out in Romans chapters 6 through 8. And as we continue down the line, we get to Noah, we find that man is doing evil in God's sight. And what does this mean? They're doing things that are completely disobedient to God. A matter of fact, outside of Noah, nobody has a thought for obeying God in any way, shape, or form. Noah's the last living person outside of his family that is obedient to God's word, is still worshiping God. So the flood happens, and it wipes away all the living creatures of the earth. It wipes away all of man except for Noah and everything that was on the ark. And Noah founds nations, or at least his sons and his grandchildren do. And as we continue down the story, we find out that Sodom and Gomorrah is doing evil to the extent that people were in the flood, pre-flood levels. So God wipes them off the face of the earth, except for Lot and his 2 daughters. And as we continue on through Abraham's line, and we get to Exodus, we find times where Israel is obedient and times where they're disobedient. When Israel is obedient, God's presence is there in the camp. And when Israel is disobedient, his presence is withdrawn. To the point where God threatens to wipe out all the Israelites and start over with Moses. And Moses pleads with God, and God relents and continues to guide the Israelites through the wilderness. We find this with King David, with King Solomon, with King Saul, before both of these guys, with all the different kings of Israel and Judah, that when they're obeying God's word, his presence is there, and when they're disobeying God's word, his presence is not there. We find this is the continued message of all of the prophets, that you are disobedient, therefore there's going to be this discipline in your life, but God will restore you to him. And ultimately this promise of restoration is fulfilled with Jesus Christ. And we find that this perfect restoration doesn't immediately restore the rest of the world. The world is still in a corrupt state, and people still have to choose Jesus. They still have to choose to be obedient to God's word as opposed to disobedient to God's word. This, I think, can be best highlighted in science through light, life, and heat. And in life, light, and heat, we find that there is death, shadow or darkness, and cold. But we know that our measurements of life, of which there are many, there's many different ways to measure healthy life as opposed to unhealthy life. There's ways to tell a bunch of different things about a person based off of a medical examination and how well they're living. But we have nothing for death. We have no way to measure death. Death is the absence of life. And because life is absent, we have no way of measuring death. We just don't. Likewise, we know what light is because we can measure it in photons. And we cannot measure death. We cannot measure darkness. I mean, in the sense of there is no measurement for darkness. There's no way to observe how much darkness is in a room. There's no way to measure how much darkness is in 1 cubic square inch of anything. But we can tell how much light is in that cubic square inch by measuring the photons. We can likewise with temperature, and I know that I've made this mistake myself, at least on a scientific level, when I complain about how cold it is outside. I'm wearing a hoodie. To my right is a coat that I will put on. The heat is on in my car as I'm parked and talking to you guys, because I do not want to be cold. Cold is the absence of heat. It's not something we actually measure. We measure how little or how much heat is in a certain area. A matter of fact, cold has a bottom. There's an absolute zero to how cold something can be. It is finite. Where heat, how hot something can be, we don't know the limits, and potentially could be infinite. But when we're measuring something that's cold, we're actually measuring how little heat there is in that situation, to the point where There is no more motion, even in atoms. And so cold itself doesn't actually exist on a scientific terms. It's just the absence of heat in something. To the complete absence or to the infinite excess of heat. Likewise, good versus evil. We know what is good, we know what is moral, we know what is right based off of what God says in our life. And while this isn't something I believe that we as human beings can expressly measure, I believe it's something that God is capable of measuring. Otherwise, the just judge would not be just. Otherwise, the holiest person would have different measurements of holiness. Either you're holy or you're not. And so what we find with evil is that it's not a creation, but it is a modifier that we use to depict whether or not something is obedient to God's word or not obedient, whether or not something is good or not. And I want to leave you guys with that thought, because I think that it closes the argument, and after a little over 10 minutes of talking, I can't imagine making a more thorough argument. Let me know if you disagree or have any objections. Thank you guys. Have a good day.